They came at night under the roar of broken bikes, calling themselves the Galactic Empire, dragging away the women of the village, while the men were forced to watch in cold silence. They arrived wearing black jackets with red patches and masks, hiding their faces, their eyes cold like stone, as they moved from house to house, kicking down doors, shouting orders in a language no one understood. They fired their guns in the air to scare the children, dragging the women by their arms as the grandmothers screamed and the babies cried under the thin light of a trembling moon. Omar watched from the shadows near the old water well, clutching a piece of wood in his hand, his breath shaking as he saw his sister Mariam pulled by her hair by a man twice. Her sighs, she did not cry, she just looked back at him, her eyes saying everything they could not speak. In that moment they took her and 3 others from their home, while the men of the village were held back by the others with guns who called themselves the Empire, laughing as they took what they wanted, believing there would be no consequences here in this dusty forgotten place. The leader of the Empire was a man with silver rings on every finger. He called himself Cade. He stood in the center of the road, looking around at the small mud houses as if he owned the ground under his feet. He pointed at the women lined up and said in a cold voice, "They now belong to us. The villagers will work for us or they will be burned." And he spat on the ground before turning away his men, dragging the women toward the trucks waiting on the edge of the village, engines rumbling under the dark sky. No one moved at first, not the elders, not the young men, standing with their heads down, the smell of fear and smoke mixing with the cold night air, the children hiding behind broken doors, looking at their mothers being taken away, the grandmothers holding on to each other, whispering prayers that felt too small for this moment. Omar felt his hands shaking, felt something burning inside his chest as he saw the last truck leaving with Mariam sitting in the back, her eyes still on him, unblinking, while the others sobbed into their hands. The sound of the engines faded into the hills, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream Omar could have made. He fell to his knees near the well, staring at the empty road, the place where his sister had stood only moments before. He felt the rage rising in him like fire under his skin, a promise forming inside his mind that this night would not be the end, that they would see what it means to take from those with nothing left to lose. Elders gathered near the old tree in the center of the village, their faces hard and tired as they argued in low voices, some saying it was too late to fight, that the Empire was too strong to, and many too ruthless, others saying they would rather die on their feet than live with this shame. Omar stood quietly at the edge, listening to every word, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with the memory of Mariam being pulled away. He knew that waiting would only mean more fear, more nights of silence, more mornings of emptiness. Wind picked up, carrying the dust through the broken streets, as Omar stepped forward and told them, "We fight, we bring them back, or we die trying." And in that moment, the men who had looked down looked up and saw in his eyes that there was no fear left, only the promise that the so-called Galactic Empire had made a mistake that would cost them everything. The men stood in a circle under the old tree, the night air cold against their skin, as they listened to Omar speak, his voice calm but heavy, like the weight of the earth itself. He told them the world was not going to save them, that the government would not come, that no one would care about a few women stolen from a forgotten village in the hills. He told them the only choice left was to take them back with their own hands or watch everything they loved turn to ash. They looked at each other, some with fear in their eyes, some with shame, some with the spark of something they thought they had lost after years of drought and empty promises. The oldest man among them, a farmer named Jalil, who had lost his son years ago in a city protest, stepped forward. He placed a hand on Omar's shoulder and nodded, telling him, "You are right, boy. They will not return what they took unless we take it back ourselves." And the others began to nod one by one, each man thinking of a wife, a sister, a daughter, that had been dragged away under the cold light of the moon. They went to their homes and gathered what they could: old rifles with cracked wood handles, machetes kept for cutting, sugarcane, rusty pistols hidden under floorboards, knives carried by fathers and grandfathers when they were young. Some men carried nothing but heavy sticks, but they came back to the tree with those weapons in hand, their eyes different now, the fear still there, but something stronger, pushing it back, something that said they were done being silent. They moved at dawn, following the tracks of the trucks through the dry grass and up into the hills. The sun was rising blood red on the horizon, turning the dust into gold as they walked. Omar led them through goat paths and dry riverbeds keeping them hidden under the shadows of broken trees. Every step was a promise that they would not return empty-handed. Every step was a prayer whispered without words to whatever God would listen. They found the first sign of the Empire in the form of a burned truck left on the side of the road. Its tires gone, the smell of fuel still in the air, bullet holes in the doors. Like small dark mouths speaking of violence, the men paused, looking at the truck, then at each other, knowing they were close. Omar crouched down and touched the dirt, seeing the bootprints heavy and careless leading toward the hills where the Empire had taken their prize. They moved silently through the brush, the sound of their breathing, and the crunch of dirt underfoot the only noise around them. They saw smoke in the distance, a thin line rising into the sky, and they knew that was where their women were being held. They felt the fear again, but Omar turned to them and said, "This is our moment. They will not see us coming, and even if they do, we will not stop." The men tightened the grips on their weapons, each one seeing the faces of the women they came for in their minds. They moved as one down the path toward the smoke, ready to face the men who called themselves the Galactic Empire. Ready to show them what happens when you steal from those who have nothing left to lose, ready to sign their own promise in blood if it meant bringing their women home. They reached the edge of the clearing as the first light of the day spilled over the hills, turning the smoke into a silver thread against the pale sky. They crouched behind dry bushes, looking at the place the Empire had chosen for their camp, a half-burned farmhouse with a rusted roof surrounded by broken trucks and stolen bikes. The men of the Empire moved around the yard, laughing, throwing scraps of food at barking dogs, while others cleaned their guns, their voices loud with the confidence of those who believe they are untouchable. Moore watched with steady eyes, counting how many men walked the yard, how many stood guard near the doors, how many slept under the trees with guns by their sides. He saw the cages lined up against the wall, women sitting inside, wrapped in old blankets, their faces tired but their eyes alive as they held each other's hands, waiting, praying that someone would come for them. Among them, Omar saw Maryam, her hair tied back, her eyes searching the horizon as if she felt him nearby. The men looked at Omar, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the plan. He simply looked back at them and nodded, pointing at the guards near the cages and the guards near the bikes. He told them with his hands where to go, what to take, who to watch. They nodded back with the silent understanding of those who have nothing left to lose. They split into small groups, moving through the brush, like shadows, every footstep careful, every breath controlled. The world felt heavy around them, as if holding its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would end. Jalel moved with two younger men around the back near Sabike's place, and glass bottles filled with fuel under the wheels, ready to burn them if the Empire tried to run. Others moved toward the trees closer to the cages, hiding behind fallen logs, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the guards who joked and smoked, unaware that the world was about to change for them forever. Omar himself moved closer to the farmhouse, crawling on his stomach through the dust until he was near enough to see the faces of the women clearly, his heart pounding but his mind calm inside. The farmhouse Cade sat in a broken chair, his boots on the table, polishing his silver rings as he talked to his men about the price they would get for the women, about how no one would dare follow them, about how they were kings in this place. His laughter loud and empty, the sound of a man who thought fear made him untouchable. But outside, in the dirt, the men of the village were watching, waiting, ready to show him that he was wrong. The sun was fully up now, turning the dirt into gold, the air heavy with heat and smoke. Omar looked back at his men and raised his hand, the signal they had agreed upon, the signal that meant no turning back. The men gripped their weapons tighter, pressing their bodies into the earth as they prepared to rise. They thought of the faces they came for, the names they carried in their hearts. They thought of what it meant to return home empty-handed, and knew they would rather die than allow it. A dog barked near the cages, and one of the guards turned his head for a moment. In that moment the world snapped like a rope pulled too tight. Omar pushed himself up from the dirt, running forward with the others behind him, the air alive with the sound of footsteps and the promise of violence. They moved toward the men who had taken their women, ready to show the Galactic Empire what happens when you steal from those who will not bow. The first guard saw Omar running and reached for his gun, but his hands were slow with the comfort of too many easy victories, and Omar was faster, swinging the butt of his rifle into the man's face, dropping him into the dirt, the sound of the hit like a drum beat calling the others to action. The men of the village came from every direction, shouting the names of their sisters and daughters as they charged with machetes and old rifles, the world exploding in a storm of dust and footsteps as they closed the distance between fear and freedom. and the young men near the bikes lit the bottles with shaking hands, throwing them under the trucks and bikes. Fire roared to life, black smoke rising into the morning air as metal twisted and tires burst. The Empire men turned at the sound of the explosions, confusion on their faces as they realized, too late, that the ground they stood on was no longer theirs. Bullets cracked through the air as the villagers fired from behind trees and rocks, every shot a promise, every shot a piece of their fear burning away in the heat of the fight near the cages. The women stood up, clutching the bars as they saw their brothers and fathers coming. Mariam saw Omar pushing through the smoke, his eyes locked on her face. She pressed her hand against the bars, her lips moving in a prayer without sound. The guard near her tried to grab his gun, but one of the village men tackled him from behind, pulling him to the ground. The two struggled in the dirt until the man from the village found a rock and brought it down again and again, until the guards stopped moving, the air thick with the smell of blood and smoke. Cade stepped out of the farmhouse, gun in hand, his sunglasses reflecting the flames around him as he fired into the smoke, shouting for his men to fight, shouting that they were the Empire, that no one could take what belonged to them. But the men of the village did not stop. They moved like water around the bullets, ducking and rolling, using the burning trucks as cover, moving closer with every moment, their eyes locked on the cages, their hearts locked on the women. They came to save one of the Empire men. Tried to run toward a bike but found it burning, the flames licking at the fuel tank as it exploded, throwing him backward into the dirt. Another tried to grab a woman to use as a shield, but the woman bit his hand and kicked him away, buying enough time for a young man from the village to slam into him with a machete, the blade dull but heavy enough to break bone, the man falling with a scream that was lost in the roar of the fire. Omar reached the cages and found the keys on the dead guard, unlocking the doors with hands that shook from rage and relief. Mariam stepped out and threw her arms around him, holding him for a breath, before pulling back to help the others out, the women stepping into the smoke with tears on their faces and fire in their eyes as they moved quickly toward the edge of the clearing, where the men formed a circle around them, weapons raised, watching the last of the Empire men stumble in confusion. The Empire had believed fear would keep them safe, but as the smoke rose into the bright sky and the last gunshots echoed across the hills, they learned that fear can also build a fire so hot it melts chains. And that day, under the burning sun, the Galactic Empire realized they had signed their death warrant the moment they captured the women of a village that would rather fight than kneel. The smoke curled into the sky, black against the morning sun, as the last of the Empire men dropped their weapons, raising their hands with fear in their eyes, seeing the villagers circle around them with rifles pointed and machetes dripping with blood. The fear they had once used to rule this place now turned back on them as the women stood beside their brothers and fathers, their hair tangled, their eyes bright with the fire of survival, no longer silent, no longer afraid. As they watched the men who had taken them stumble and beg for mercy, Cade was on his knees in the dirt, his sunglasses cracked, his silver rings covered in dust, as he looked up at Omar and the others who stood in a tight circle around him, the guns steady in their hands, the flames from the burning bikes reflecting in their eyes. Cade tried to speak, tried to say that it was just business, that he could pay them, that he could leave and never return, but the words fell flat in the hot air, the wind carrying them away. As Omar stepped forward, his boots crushing the dirt as he looked down at the man who had taken his sister and called himself a king. "You think you are the Empire," Omar said, his voice quiet in the chaos around them. "You think you can take what you want and leave, but today you learn what it means to take from people who have nothing left to lose." And Cade saw in Omar's eyes that there would be no forgiveness, no mercy, no deal to save him from what he had done. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only the dry sound of fear and dust as the villagers closed in around him, their voices low as they spoke the names of the women. He had Tucangelo stepped forward, holding a rope in his hands, the same rope he had used to tie bundles of sugarcane in the fields, now repurposed for justice. As he tied Cade's hands behind his back, the other men gathering the remaining Empire soldiers, forcing them to their knees in the dirt, the women standing in a line, watching, their faces calm, their eyes sharp, as they looked at the men who had dragged them from their homes, under the cold light of the moon, now reduced to nothing more than shaking bodies in the dust. Villagers moved quickly, pulling supplies from the burned trucks, water, food, blankets and weapons, gathering what could be used, what could help them rebuild, what could keep them safe for the days to come. The children came from the trees, running to their mothers, their small arms wrapping around them as the women dropped to their knees, crying into their hair, holding them tight as the men kept watch, rifles in hand, eyes scanning the hills for any sign of more trouble. Omar turned and saw Mariam standing near the cages, looking at him with tears running down her cheeks, but her back straight, her eyes clear. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly for a moment before pulling away, telling him, "It is not over, they will come back for revenge. We must be ready." And Omar nodded, knowing she was right, knowing that this victory was only the beginning, that the Empire would not forget this day and would return. But he also knew that fear would never again rule their village. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers stood together in the clearing, surrounded by the smoke and the scent of blood and fire, knowing they had taken back what was theirs, knowing they had shown the Galactic Empire that they had signed their death warrant. The moment they captured the women of a village that would rather burn than bow, they tied the captured Empire men to the burned trucks, using scraps of wire and rope, the prisoners' faces covered in sweat and ash as they sat under the harsh sun, their eyes darting from the villagers to the smoking wreckage, to the bodies in the dirt. The fear in their eyes was real now, as they realized that the power they believed would protect them had vanished like smoke in the wind. The women stood in a line watching them, remembering the nights in the cages, remembering the cold hands that dragged them away, remembering every insult, every slap, every look of ownership that had been thrown at them by men who now sat trembling in the dirt. Tamar stood with Jalil and Mariam, looking at the scene in silence, the flames from the last burning bike crackling as the black smoke drifted across the clearing. They had won this battle, but the cost was in their eyes. The bruises on the women, the blood on the machetes, the shaking hands of the young men who had never held a weapon before, but had fought like lions when it mattered. Mariam placed a hand on Omar's arm, telling him, "We are alive and we are free, but we need to be ready. They will come." And Omar knew it was true. He could already feel the tension in the air, like a storm waiting. Just beyond the hills, they searched the bodies of the Empire men, taking what they could find: bullets, knives, old radios. One of the radios crackled to life, and a voice came through, sharp and angry, demanding a report, demanding to know why no one was answering, demanding to know where Cade was. Omar picked up the radio and held it for a moment before dropping it to the ground and crushing it under his boot. The voice turned into a crackle of static as the villagers looked at him and nodded, knowing that the message was clear. The Empire would know something had happened here, but they would not know who had done it. They buried their dead near the old tree in the village, wrapping the bodies in cloth and laying them under the ground, with the women and children standing around whispering prayers as the wind moved through the dry grass, the graves marked with stones. The promise in the hearts of the villagers that their deaths would not be forgotten, that their blood had bought freedom, even if for a short time. And the children looked at the graves with wide eyes, understanding that their fathers and brothers had fought for them so they could walk the village without fear. That night the village gathered near the well where it had all started, lighting a small fire. As the stars came out above them, the sky wide and silent, Mariam spoke to the women, telling them they were not victims. They were survivors, that they were stronger than the men who had tried to break them, that they would build something new out of the ashes. Omar spoke to the men, telling them the Empire would come back, but that fear would not rule them again, that they would teach their children to fight, to protect, to never bow to those who bring chains. In the darkness of that night, with the stars looking down on the tired faces of the villagers, they made a promise that the next time the Galactic Empire came to their lands, they would not find a village waiting in fear. They would find warriors, waiting in the shadows, ready to show them again that the moment they took their women, they had signed their death warrant, and the earth itself would rise against them. The days passed, with the heat pressing down on the village, the smell of burned metal still lingering in the air, as the villagers worked in silence, fixing roofs, digging new wells, sharpening blades, and cleaning the rifles they had taken from the Empire men. The women moved through the village with heads high, carrying water and food, watching the horizon, every morning waiting for the sign of dust that would mean the Empire was coming back for revenge. The children played near the well, but their games were different now, pretending to be warriors with sticks as rifles, pretending to protect the women, pretending to stand guard against the shadows that would return. Omar stood near the edge of the village every morning before the sun was fully up, looking toward the hills with eyes that did not blink, scanning the roads and the sky for any sign of movement. He knew they would come. He could feel it in the way the birds went silent in the evenings, in the way the dogs barked at the wind, in the way Mariam would sometimes pause while carrying water, looking toward the hills with her lips pressed into a hard line, the fire in her eyes never leaving, even as she smiled at the children. who ran past her they trained in the evenings, using sticks and old knives, moving through the dust, learning to fight as a group, moving as one, listening to the sounds of the earth under their feet, the crack of dry grass, the rustle of leaves, the whistle of the wind. Jalil would correct their stances, his old hands strong, as he showed them how to swing a blade, how to hold a rifle, how to breathe. When you are afraid so that your fear does not control you, the young men listened with serious eyes as the women stood behind them learning the same lessons, ready to fight for the freedom they had bled to take back at night. They sat around small fires sharing stories of the raid, how they had moved through the smoke, how they had felt their fear break under the weight of their anger, how they had seen the Empire men run for the first time. The laughter was small, but it was real, cutting through the heavy air like a promise that even in the shadow of revenge there would still be moments of life, moments of hope. Maryam would speak to the women, telling them to teach their daughters to be strong, to teach them to fight, to teach them to never let fear become a chain around their necks. The elders spoke of old days when the Empire had first come, promising protection and trade, but bringing only chains and empty stomachs. They reminded the young that freedom was not given, that it was taken with blood, and kept with vigilance, that the Empire would not stop just because they had been beaten once, that the real fight was in keeping what they had won, and in building something stronger from the ashes that remained. The villagers listened with quiet respect, understanding that the war was not over, it had only changed shape. One night a scout came running from the hills, his face covered in sweat, his breath ragged, as he said he saw lights in the distance, trucks moving under the cover of darkness, dust rising under the moon. The Empire was coming back, and they were coming with more men, more guns, more fire. Omar looked at the villagers who stood in the firelight, their shadows long and dark against the ground, and he told them, "This is what we have been waiting for. Let them come, we will show them again that the day they took our women, they signed their death warrant." The night was heavy with silence as the villagers gathered their weapons and hid along the narrow paths leading to the village. The air smelled of dust and sweat as Omar moved between the shadows, checking that each man and woman was ready for what was coming. The stars above felt close and cold, as if watching with sharp eyes. The children were hidden deep in the old storage pit under blankets, with the elders sitting with them whispering prayers as the sound of engines began to grow. In the distance, a low rumble like thunder rolling across dry earth, shaking the bones of those who waited in the dark. Maryam sat near the well with a rifle across her knees, her hair tied back, her eyes locked on the road, her hands steady. Even as her breath came slow and deep, she felt the fear, but she did not let it control her. She felt it burning into something sharper, something that would keep her alive when the moment came. Jalil stood behind her with a machete resting against his shoulder, his old eyes watching the hills, his heart steady as he remembered the fields he used to work, the laughter of his wife, who was taken by the Empire years ago, the promise he made to himself that he would see the end of those who broke families. With chains the lights came first, moving like ghosts between the trees, headlights sweeping across the dark. The trucks painted black with the symbol of the Galactic Empire on their doors, men sitting in the back holding rifles, scanning the shadows, unaware of how many eyes watched them from the darkness. The engines stopped near the burned trucks where the last battle had ended. The Empire soldiers jumped down, moving slowly, checking the ground, finding the marks of the last fight, the ashes, the twisted metal, the bones of the men they left behind, their voices low as they spoke to each other about how this time they would crush the village for good. Mar gave the signal with a small flick of his hand, and the silence shattered like glass. Underfoot, a single gunshot from the shadows hitting the first Empire soldier in the chest, dropping him into the dirt. The other villagers opened fire from the trees, from the rooftops, from behind. Broken walls, bullets tearing through the night as the Empire men scrambled for cover, shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. The trucks became targets as Jalil and the others threw burning bottles under the wheels, flames roaring to life as the men inside screamed, trying to climb out, only to be met with blades and bullets from every direction. Maryam fired into the headlights, shattering the glass and plunging the area into darkness, the muzzle flashes lighting her face as she moved between shots, keeping low her eyes on the shadows, looking for movement. The women who had been taken before now stood beside her, firing with steady hands, their anger guiding them as they remembered the cold of the cages, the hands that dragged them into the dark, the nights they swore to survive, so they could see this moment when they would take back what was theirs. The Empire tried to regroup, pushing forward with rifles raised, shouting that they were the law, shouting that they were the Empire, but the villagers did not stop. They moved through the smoke like ghosts, striking from the shadows, disappearing and reappearing, hitting again and again, showing the Empire that fear could be used as a weapon against those who thought themselves untouchable. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the crackle of flames, the cries of men who realized too late that they had stepped into the fire. As the battle raged under the cold stars, Omar moved through the chaos, his eyes locked on the Empire captain who barked orders near the last truck. Omar knew this was the man who ordered the taking of their women, who ordered the burning of their homes, who believed he could walk into their land and rule with fear. Omar tightened his grip on his rifle and began to move toward him, ready to end what had begun. The night the Empire took what was not theirs. Omar moved through the smoke and the cries of men, as the flames rose around him, the night alive with the sounds of war, his eyes never leaving the Empire captain who stood near the last truck, shouting into a radio, calling for backup, calling for air support, calling for anything to save him from the fire. He had walked into. The captain turned and saw Omar coming, his hand going to the pistol at his belt. But his eyes showed fear, real fear for the first time, as he realized the man walking toward him was not going to stop. The captain fired once, missing as the bullet snapped past Omar's ear, and Omar did not flinch. He kept walking, raising his rifle and firing. Once, twice, three times, until the captain dropped the radio, falling to the ground with his mouth open, as if to curse the world that refused to obey him. The villagers pushed forward through the flames, driving the last of the Empire men into the dirt, their rifles empty now, using machetes and clubs and rocks. The night filled with the sounds of metal hitting flesh, the Empire men screaming for mercy that would not come as the women stood behind the line of men, rifles in both hand, eyes cold as they watched the men who had dragged them into cages, who had laughed as they cried, now begging with tears in their eyes. The women did not speak. They did not need to speak. The silence was enough. The silence was justice in its truest formula. Stood over one of the Empire's soldiers who had tried to run, grabbing him by the collar, lifting him off the ground, his old eyes burning, as he asked, "Do you know whose land this is? Do you know what you took from us?" The man could only shake his head, sobbing as Galil dropped him to the ground, turning away as the women stepped forward, pulling the man into the darkness, where the others waited, where the women who had been taken would decide what would be done with him. The Empire had come with chains, but now the chains were broken, and the ones who had carried them were the ones who could not run fast enough. Mariam stood near the well again, the rifle still in her hands as she looked at the bodies around her, the Empire trucks burning, sending black smoke into the stars, the ground littered with weapons and radios crackling, with voices that would never get an answer. She felt the tears on her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of release, of a promise kept that they would never be taken again. Omar came to her, touching her shoulder, telling her, "It is done, it is over," and she looked at him and said, "It is never over, but tonight, we have one ace." The sun began to rise, the villagers gathered near the well, the children coming out from hiding, their small eyes wide as they saw the burned trucks, the bodies, the weapons in the hands of their mothers and fathers. The elders began to speak, telling the children to look, telling them to remember, telling them that freedom is not given, it is taken and kept with blood and courage, and the willingness to fight. The Empire will come again, they said, but when they do, they will find us ready. They will find us waiting. They will find us unafraid. The wind moved through the village, carrying the scent of smoke and ash, but also the scent of the earth, the promise of life growing again, the promise of mornings without fear. The villagers raised their weapons to the sky as the sun broke over the hills. The light touching their faces, the fire in their eyes burning brighter than the flames around them. They shouted to the sky, letting the world hear them, letting the Empire hear them, letting every man who would think to take from them hear them. The day they took our women was the day they signed their death warrant.